next installment of our table topper of the month. This month we have our holiday or our Christmas related table topper designed for us, again finishing at 36 by 36. This month is a pretty easy pieced project based all on techniques that we have done in previous months. So let's take a look and discuss cutting information. So we have a few things here with cutting that we want to go over. You want to make sure that you have made sure that you're going to be cutting the right fabrics, the right sizes, double check everything. So there are two different shades of green in this project. The darker shade is turtle, the lighter shade is key lime. Then we have red texture. You have a solid black, or black texture, actually it's not really solid, almost looks solid. Black texture. We have a slate texture, and then you have a overcast texture. So slate is light, overcast is the darker, and then we have a cream texture for that. When you're going through and cutting for this project, you can probably get a few combinations of things. So for example, in the turtle texture, they have you cut 3 2.5-inch strips and then tell you how to subcut them. You can actually get 2 shape Ds and 2 Bs out of 1 strip. So that would be, out of 1 42-inch strip, we can get 2 12.5s and 2 8.5s from this. If you try to cut all of them out of single strips, you may not have the right combination of fabric together. So make sure when you're working on this that you take your strip, and if you're done cutting maybe 12.5s, see what's left and subcut the remaining of another size out of the remaining strip versus just moving on to another full strip. I hope that makes sense. If not, feel free to contact me for that. We are going to be doing basic techniques here for this project with our half square triangles and our fold back corner piecing. So let's take a look and have a little review about some of our project. So first, as a review, I want to talk about half square triangles. In this technique, we take our half square triangle. We are going to draw a line from one corner to the other. We are going to stitch 1/4 inch from each side of that line, and then we're going to cut. Now, depending upon your method or preferred method for squaring up your blocks, I'm going to use that folded corner trimmer that we've been using a lot this month. This particular block I'm going to square up to be a 2.5-inch square. So I'm going to take my folded corner clipper ruler. I'm going to place this seam line right along the line that I sewed, and I'm going to slide it kind of diagonally down so that I can have a little bit, I can trim my dog ear off the top, and I have a little bit down here on the left that I can trim. And actually, if I turn it this way, I'll be able to trim it without having to reach at a funny angle. But I don't want this end to be any less than 2.5. So I don't want it to be on this side of the 2.5-inch line, because then I'm going to be too short. So I'm going to trim that, and I'm going to trim this. So I'm going to then flip my 2.5-inch square. My newly trimmed edge is now down at the bottom. My trimmed corner is down at the bottom. I'm going to line 2.5 inches up directly with that nicely trimmed edge and corner, and I'm going to trim the other sides. That's going to give me a perfectly square 2.5-inch half square triangle with no dog ears to clip. And you're going to pay attention in the pattern to where they have you press your seams We're going to be pressing these seams open for this particular project, just like that. There is one main thing about this project is pay very, very close attention to color combinations. For example, there are 3 different color combinations of half square triangles. You want to make sure that you put the right half square triangles together. What you are seeing here as an example is not a color combination. This was just done as an example for you guys, because in my scraps, I didn't really have an appropriate size scrap remaining to make a truly matching half square triangle for you. Our other thing that we're going to be doing are 4 patches for today. So in the pattern, we're going to take basically 2 sets L and N, which are done, again, we have 2 different color combinations that we're going to be doing them in. And we have 1 set of combination that has cream and 1 that is your slate. And then we have 1 with slate and 1 with overcast. We are going to sew these strips together with a 1/4 inch seam. We are going to press the strip seam allowances towards the slate texture. So towards the lighter color, we're going to be pressing those seams. So when you press your seam, what I like to do, I like to set my seam. And setting my seam is basically just taking my iron, setting it down on top of the seam, and kind of helping the fabric accept the thread or kind of absorb the thread. Setting that seam helps for this to fold back easier. And I always set my seam with the fabric up that the seam needs to go towards. So if in the directions here, for example, they're telling you to press the seam towards this slate color. So I'm going to lay my strip set on the ironing board with the slate color up. I'm going to set my seam. So I'm just going to take my iron and set it down on top. And then I'm going to fold that back. I mean, just by setting the seam, it almost looks almost ironed completely and ready for me without any like fiddling. It also helps to make sure that you don't get any of those strip sets that, you know, have like, they're pushed back here and you've got a lip that's happening here. We want everything pushed back as far back over that seam allowance as we can, because our goal here is that this needs to be 4.5 inches tall. If we don't get to 4.5 inches tall here, I'm not, again, using the right size strips. So please don't pay attention to my number here. But because again, we didn't have any scraps left for these samples in the appropriate sizes. So 4.5 inches tall is the number that we are looking for. If your strip set is not 4.5 inches tall, you're never going to be able to get a 4.5 inch square out of it. If it's not 4.5 inches, then it's possible that 1, your seam allowance is not a true 1/4 inch, or 2, you've not pressed it back well enough, or you have not cut the appropriate size strip, which these are not the appropriate size strip. The other strip set is also getting pressed towards the slate fabric, so I'm going to set that seam, and then I'm going to flip this back, and I'm going to press that. Once you have your strip sets, you're going to be cutting these into 2.5 inch segments. So I'm going to take my strip set, I'm going to line it up on the mat with a straight edge. I'm going to square up my raw edge here that I'm going to be measuring from. So I'm going to line that up and square it up. And then I'm going to measure over 2.5 inches. So I'm going to get my ruler here. I'm going to find my 2.5 inch line. I'm going to line my 2.5 inch line up with my nice, fresh, straight cut edge. But I'm also going to make sure that a line on my ruler lines up with this seam. If you're at 2.5 and you know this line on the ruler doesn't line up exactly with a line on the seam, you're not working with a straight edge. So I'm going to hold on to that, 2.5, and I'm going to cut. And we're going to continue to do that until you get the appropriate number of pieces. So as you work down the strip, if your alignment starts to get off in terms of you can't get 2.5 with this also being straight, we need to stop and re-square up your edge. Take this one, I'm going to do the same thing. Just use this ruler to square up the edge. And then we're going to cut 2.5. 2.5, straight line, and I'm going to cut. We're going to be basically making a 4-patch, but we're going to do this so that slate color never touches each other. They're always diagonal, and because we've pressed the seams towards the slate each time, when we put these right sides together and we go to sew, these seams will nest into each other. So they'll be just like that, and then when you can pin it, you can clip it, it's completely your choice. I'm going to head to the sewing machine and we're going to sew this strip. So now our strip set is sewn here, our little 4-patch. We have our nice seam where they intersect. You can open it up and double check. You can see that they come together exactly in the point where we want them to come together. And then we're going to press these seams open. We have a lot of these 4-patches that we're going to be doing in this project. You can press the seam open if you would like, or you could swirl press the center. It's completely up to you. And if you've never seen a swirl press, let me show you what that is. So in a swirl press, we take out the 1 or 2 stitches that are in the seam allowance up to the line that we just sewed. And then when we open this, this is going to allow half the seam allowance to press one direction and half the seam allowance to press another. And that's going to help give you a much flatter center. And that's the same thing that would happen if you press the seam open. It's going to give you a less bulky center versus everything being pushed to one side. And then you have all these layers that are happening on this one area. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 7 layers right there if you pressed your 4-patch in one direction. But by splitting it with a swirl or pressing it open, we have taken this section down to 4 layers. And because, again, we made sure that this was a 4.5 tall unit when we did this, we also want to make sure that we have a 4.5 inch square when we are done with this as well. So we have a variety of half square triangles to make that we're going to press seams open with. We have some flying geese that need to be assembled using the fold back corner method. And if you remember that method, that's where we place a square in the corner. We draw a line from corner to corner and then sew on the line and then trim it off and fold it back. You have some very general instructions that are given to you. I've also talked about them in almost every previous month of Table Topper of the Month videos. We've talked about sew and flip method. It's a very popular technique that we use in quilting. Let's talk about putting all that together. The center block. It is it's very basic. It's half square triangles and flying geese, but you've got to pay a lot of attention to, again, the combination, the direction that fabric goes in order to get this to lay the way that you want it to lay or land the way that it needs to in order to give you the appearance of that look. Once you have all your individual units made, all your 4-patches, all your flying geese, all your half square triangles and everything, we can start assembling. This quilt is done with a center block, which has the center star plus the top of all 4 trees. It is made up of 4 star blocks for the corners and 4 tree blocks for the middles. So you kind of have to think about this quilt as a big giant 9 patch that we will assemble. Your center unit, once you have it assembled according to the diagram on page 3 of the pattern, following all the instructions for pressing seams in the directions that are required, you are going to end up with a 12.5-inch center block. Once you have your center block made, I would then move on to making your 4 star blocks that you need for the corner, for each corner of your project. So that block goes from basically here to here. It's just this center star. And then we are going to be doing the trees. Now, be very, very specific with your trees. Look at the instructions. Make sure you've got the right green, that you are going the correct direction for your fold back and sew and flip corner. And make sure you're picking up the right color squares to be sewing on the ends of different branches. Not all 4 units of this tree are done identical. So you need to make sure that you are putting the right colors on the right ends and they're going in the right directions. So your complete and undivided attention is required in assembling this month's project so that you can get it to look the way that it's supposed to look. We don't want our trees to look like they've been through a tornado. Now, in the instructions, they have you press your seams open once you have sewn the rows together. And everything on this project is pretty much being pressed open. So there you go. Nice big pressed open, beautiful back that we have on there. Your center corner stars, when they're done, should be 8.5. Your tree units, once you have your 4 tree units done, they will be 8.5 by 12.5. And make sure that when you finish your tree units that you label them 1, 2, 3, and 4, because again, they are different for you. We will then lay out your quilt top in the manner that it should, and you will follow trunk 1, trunk 2, tree 1, stars. Make sure that when you lay your stars out, that they are going in the right direction. So pay attention to the diagrams. The main matching points that you're going to find when putting together this unit is going to be where the flying geese from the center block lines up with the top of the tree block that we have. I think we got pretty much all of them. We did work a little hard to get them to all line up. So you may want to make sure that you pin match this section, because you don't really have, out in these areas you have definite seams, straight seams, but sometimes it's harder to match angles to make sure that things line up. So you may want to get things lined up and then come here and maybe baste the 1/4 inch over top of this section of the flying geese, and then open up the block to make sure you're happy with it. If so, then you can put it back to right sides together and you can finish sewing with a standard 1/4 inch with a standard stitch length. And that way, if you do need to make adjustments, you're not constantly seam ripping your normal stitch length. You can take out your basting and then restitch it. Make your adjustments and restitch it for that. Now, if we take a look at how it is quilted here, some pretty basic quilting. The trees are just straight line quilted from left to right all the way up. They look maybe about a 1/2 inch in between each line. In your red stars in the corner, it looks like it's just echo quilted around the outer edges, and then it's stitched from corner to corner in. And then all of the background squares of our plaid that we've created are just stitched with a slight arc from corner to corner. You could free motion this. This to me would probably be more exact, and you could be more exact if you do it with ruler work. So doing this technique with ruler work is going to help guarantee that you get all the arcs at the same height and things along that lines. So join me over at my machine and we're going to talk just quickly about ruler work. Okay, let's chat about ruler work just for a moment. So ruler work is a technique we do with free motion. It uses a ruler work foot and a specific or specialty ruler designed for ruler work. Now I'm working on a Bernina Q20 in a table here for today. So we are working on a Bernina, therefore I'm using foot number 72. This is our adjustable height ruler work foot. As a Bernina, we use our rulers can be the long arm thickness rulers. So depending upon your machine and your brand, it's going to depend upon what type of ruler work foot you have, what thickness of ruler your ruler work foot will allow for you. So I would suggest contacting your local dealer to make sure that you can do this technique or get the proper equipment. You cannot do ruler work without a ruler work foot. Please do not try. But for any Bernina, new or old, we can get a foot number 72 ruler work foot, and any Bernina using a foot 72 can use long arm thickness rulers for this technique. Now, just like free motion, ruler work is something that does take practice. It doesn't happen overnight. So all of these shapes were done in free motion with a ruler. None of this was truly like me just guiding the fabric. I was following the edge of a ruler for this technique. So that little twist that you see in the squares of your table topper were probably done with ruler work. So the big thing to know about ruler work is that the needle is in center, and typically, at least on the Bernina feet, and I think it's pretty standard for all ruler work feet, is that the distance from the needle center to the edge of the foot is 1/4 of an inch. So if you, depending upon what you're doing or where you're at, you've got to keep that concept of 1/4 of an inch in your head, that you're actually stitching against the ruler, you're actually stitching a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the ruler. So I'm actually going to pull my bobbin thread up to the top. I'm going to put my foot down and put my needle down. Never bring a ruler up to your foot until your foot is down, because we don't want this to accidentally land on top of the ruler before we go to do this. Now I would typically, you know what, let's start in the corner because then we can be consistent about the direction that we travel. Okay, so I'm going to come over here and I'm going to raise and lower this, and then we're going to put this back down. There we go. I am by far an expert in ruler work. I'm just learning myself, getting time to practice and things along that lines. So it just takes a little bit of time. For this particular technique, you're going to need a circle ruler so that you can get the arc, is one of the main things that we need to do. And then you're also going to want to probably have some sort of ruler gauge so that we can gauge our placement. Because we are stitching a 1/4 inch away, we can't just bring the ruler to start in the corner and end in the corner, because the needle is actually a 1/4 inch away from it. So now that I've got my foot dropped, I'm going to kind of butt my ruler up there, and I have this gauge, this ruler gauge. I'm going to mark 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to slide this up a little bit. I have some markings that are happening on my ruler that are lining up with maybe the seams that you have in there, but because I don't really land on a line, there's not really a line on my ruler that lands up with my seam. I'm going to take some tape once I have that marked here, and I'm going to mark that. So this tape will always be what I use to line up with my seam. This is just washi tape from the craft store. Nothing fancy. It's not any fancy tape or anything, and that's still a little crooked. Okay, so I've got the top of this tape is lined up with my seam that's in there. Once you have your ruler in place, we are gonna keep the ruler foot butted up against the ruler as we go and stitch along this shape. Now you'll see that I have some of my fingers holding the ruler and the rest of my hand is holding on to the quilt on the underside. And our goal is to stitch from this corner to the other corner, making sure that we are stitching all the way up to and keeping the ruler foot on the ruler. Now, once we get to that corner, we can make a, you can trim your tails unless you're planning to bury them. And then we can move our ruler over and repeat this process. Now, I am using a Q series machine here, which has ruler work regulation. So we actually have stitch regulators in the bottom of the Q series machine that allows us to use stitch regulation with rulers. On a regular domestic machine on your Bernina, there is no ruler work done with a stitch regulator. So therefore you do have to regulate your stitching when you opt to use ruler work. Now, if you're stitching and you don't exactly come to the exact corner, not a problem, make an adjustment. I noticed that I needed to be a little bit higher in my chair so that I could make sure that that tape was lining up with the seam that I was doing it. And as you get to the bottom straight across your quilt, you can then turn the corner, stitch down the side, and then work your way back again the other direction. As you work your way back down the seam, just taking your time, one block at a time. I'm going to turn the corner here, stitch the other side, and then we can break our thread, leave a tail for tying a knot, or manually pack your stitches here, completely your choice. For me, I would be working into the excess backing and batting. Now I'm going to come and we're going to move to another row, pull up our bobbin thread, line up our ruler, and stitch. It does get easier, it does take practice. Again, rotate, work your way down the side of the quilt, or turn it around and travel back along the same line that we just stitched to finish the other portion of the arc. Now, typically for me, I would be using a thread that matched my background, blended in, so you wouldn't see any areas that maybe didn't exactly match or line up the way that I wanted. I also prefer to quilt in 50 weight thread versus anything thicker. The thicker you go in your thread, the more you are going to make your quilting stand out for your project. So I usually blend to something that's going to match all the thread colors for your project. Now, I highly recommend that if this interests you, that you go get yourself a foot, you get yourself a ruler, and then you give it a try. Also be on the lookout for ruler work classes. Well, we look forward to seeing your finished table topper for the month of December. And we'll see you soon for another episode of Riley Blake's Table Topper of the Month. Thanks, everybody.